What's going on, guys? Let's give some context and let's talk about some of the reasons why small pinball manufacturers like Rowamet might have copied tables and made direct clones of popular US machines from manufacturers like Gottlieb and Bally. So we know that Rowamet was not the only pinball manufacturer to do this. LTD do Brasil did it, Taito do Brasil did it, and even some, Spanish pinball manufacturers. But the big picture here is there are some things that it's easy to kind of say, hey, why didn't they just make their own machine, right? Why didn't these machines, instead of copying, just come up with their own idea? But let me give you some context, which will make it easier to understand why this was a common practice for these Brazilian manufacturers. So a lot of this has to do with the result of certain restrictions on imports and costs. During the 1970s and 1980s, it was extremely expensive to import American pinball machines, and sometimes even illegal. So it was seen as a form of substitution. The thinking was, if you can't import it, why not try to recreate it and bypass all these restrictions? A lot of times, these smaller pinball companies would basically reverse engineer the tables and would use locally made components and soundboards. This is where you get the minute differences when you play these tables. Even though they have the same layout and they have different playfield art, you'll also have different sound effects because they're using different components. And this is because these tables that they were cloning weren't officially licensed, right? So they're using their own parts. And so at the same time, the intellectual property laws in Brazil were also kind of inconsistent and soft. Plus, the companies like Gottlieb or Williams really had no legal presence in countries like Brazil to enforce the penalties. And so companies like Rowamet figured it would be easier to copy the tables that were already successful in the US instead of having to create their own original design. So that's really the primary reasons why these companies did it, was because of the tariff cost of importing them, and they figured if copying the table was easier because the tables that they were making clones of were already popular in the US, so they didn't have to think about their own original design. But here comes the caveat. I think the biggest downside to all of this is you had the skill and labor to be able to create these tables. What if companies like Rowamet and LTD do Brasil and Taito were more into creating their own original designs? Now, sometimes they did. Taito's Shark was an example of a completely original design that turned out to be a big hit, as we saw in the previous video. But it just makes you think, what about companies like Rowamet, whose 6 tables that they created during their short lifespan from 1980 to 1983, they could have created a hit table on their own. So I think, there was some, downfall to that, right? But you think about the bigger picture was companies like Rowamet and LTD do Brasil and Taito were making pinball accessible to smaller regions in countries like Brazil that were already experiencing a sort of pinball renaissance. And so I think that's the bigger picture, is these smaller companies, although they copied machines from US manufacturers, their role in spreading pinball to that part of the world was pretty huge. Without these companies, I don't know if pinball would be that popular in Brazil or those parts of South America today. So hopefully you enjoyed this video and you understand the context of why there's so many clones of these popular US tables. Till next time.